Hi, brothers and sisters. Hope you're doing well. This is going to be a prophecy focus, and we're going to study in on, focus in on the final beast empire and the aspects of that, how it's going to arise, how we expect it to rise, events that are happening right now, but some of the things that we should be looking for, and how do we know who it is? How do we distinguish who it is? Because there's people out there who get it a lot of times confused. They see things happening in Russia, they see things happening overseas, and they think, oh, well, could they be, the Antichrist? Or is Gog of Ezekiel 38 and 39 the Antichrist kingdom, and these kind of things. So I thought it would be important to kind of focus in on this final end times empire, beast empire that's going to arise. And I think it's very nearer than many people may believe. And I see the beginning elements, the infant elements of it already emerging. And I'll get into that as we go through. But we're going to be focusing on a few various verses. So if you have a pen, you have a Bible, you can write these down and study on your own, but certainly you want to jot these down. We're going to be going through Daniel chapter 2, verses 40 through 43. We're going to be going through Daniel 8, 23 through 26, Daniel 9, 26. We're going to look at Daniel 11, 36 through 45, and we'll look at Revelation a little bit in 13 and 17, and primarily focusing in on chapter 17, verses 7 through 13. So those are going to be. So we'll try to get it all in. This is probably going to be a two-part one, but we'll certainly try to get it all in here. And the reason why I think it's so important, because I think the time is really advancing. I see that a lot of things that's going to emerge as I look at Scripture. It's going to be that there's going to be a combination of a final empire that's going to rise up, and I think it will come after the Gog-Magog war. I think the Gog-Magog war will create a vacuum politically in the world with the kings of the East, and I believe that will be China and India and probably North Korea and whoever else is associated with, those will be the primary ones, that will form an alliance in this last days where they're waiting in the wings, as it were, while this beast empire will fill that void, and that void will be filled by a most likely either 10 nations or 7 nations, depending on how you look at it. I believe it's possibly 12 by 10. And it could be 7, but it'd be 10 leaders for sure. And we know it'll be 10 leaders. That's the main thing that we got to look at. So something that with 10 leaders, 3 will be overthrown at some point, and the Antichrist will come up, and in essence, remove these 3 leaders and replace them with himself, in some sense. So 3 will be removed. He'll become the supreme leader, as it were, over this final empire that's going to arise. And it'll be a coalition, alliance of nations, it seems like. And we'll get into that as we get into Daniel 2 here in just a little bit. But so we would expect to see that there's going to be one that will arise, and it will come out of the West. And we'll get into why I think that is, but the Bible, I think, especially in chapter Daniel 11, 36 through 45, really cements it in the fact that it's out of the West. I think Daniel 9, 26 also does the same when it talks about the people who destroy the temple. We know that the Romans destroyed the temple in AD 70, so the 10th Legion. So we know that that's probably going to be the case. It will be a revived form of this final beast empire, the Roman Empire. So remember, it started off as singular in Rome, expanded out to Constantinople and Rome to expand it. And then we see the 10 toes, and we'll see that as we get into it. And I think it's the expansion again, only this one will be much broader, much wider, and it will, in essence, have the vestiges, the imagery, many of the aspects of the Roman Empire, in essence, being that global world police force, as it were. But it will be far more expansive and more global in nature, and I think it will encompass many other nations, not just the element of what we would call Rome today, but an expanse from that. So I believe America will probably be if not one of the preeminent nations, the preeminent nation, one of those of this leading this new coalition that will take on the vestiges, the outlook, the imagery, the things of it, also the idolatry of it, and so forth of Rome. That's what I think. And I think when you look at America, it often fits most of that. And having the preeminent empire and power in the world, militarily and so forth, I think will be a part of that. Also expanded out into an alliance of nations that will become this final global world order established that will make up an economic version of it, a global secularized religious institution, one that is, which sounds like an oxymoron, but it's got elements of the secular world encompassed into this ecumenical view of religion, so that you have religion infused with secular ideals and principles. And that's what we see happening right now. And that's why you see a church that is embracing homosexuality or transgenderism. That's why you see the embrace of Islam and Judaism to a degree, and others, all coming together in this kind of ecumenical type of fashion. Acceptance of every ideal, not adhering to the truth, but false ideology of humanism infused in the form of religion and acceptance and love. That's really what they profess, when in fact they have no love for one who holds to the truth and exclusive truth of Christianity and the salvation which is by Christ Jesus alone. They reject that person as being a hater, and you'll be hated by all around the world because of that. And I think we're seeing this infusion of a global world religion happening right now. And we're also seeing a global economic system. Again, this is going to come to play out when we look at Revelation chapter 13, 17, and 18. But we won't be able to read them all, but we're certainly going to look at them. And we're going to see a global, interconnected world economic system that ultimately be headed up by this final beast empire, and it be headed up ultimately by the Antichrist. And in it, he will have this economic global mark, which we all know as the mark of the beast. But in this process, we already see the vestige of, or we already see the imagery of that, the infant elements of it occurring right now. How they're applying that to other nations like Russia, or with the Ukrainian thing going on, and how they're applying economic sanctions throughout the world, between Europe and America, really devastating ones. Same thing with Iran, Turkey to a degree, North Korea to a degree. See those same things happening economically, where they're forcing the wheel on these other nations. And when we see this vacuum of these nations, when they're destroyed in the Gog-Magog war and defeated, in this huge vacuum in the world, you're going to see nothing really standing in the way for them to bring in, usher in this new world order that will have this new global economic control system, combined with the global control over the media, propaganda that goes out to indoctrinate the masses into its mantra and its ideals and premises of what I just talked about: relativism, acceptance of everything and anybody, and rejection of the truth of Jesus Christ and exclusivity of Jesus Christ, rejecting that truth while embracing the lie of Satan that all people in essence are children of God, in essence are little gods. That's really what they teach you. That's what really the world and the lies of Satan is. Same thing he told Eve. You can be like God. You can know your own truth, desire your own truth, feel be like God, know the difference between good and evil. That's really what the lie of ecumenicalism and globalism is happening. It's going to be some element of global religion, global economic system, and also a global control system, which will control every aspect of your life, buying, selling, trade, everything. So we're going to see that as well in this final beast empire, and ultimately will lead to the rebuilding of the Jewish temple, and ultimately he will go in and declare himself to be God, which is why I believe the Antichrist will be Jewish. Because a Gentile wouldn't be able to walk into the temple much just and declare himself to be God. But if he's the one that's working out a peace agreement, putting it all together, bringing this in, and bringing about global world peace, that perfectly fits what people would expect if you're reading the Old Testament through the eyes and lenses of the Old Testament, and not through the lens of the New Testament, which is why many Jews will fall victim to the lies that this final Antichrist is. And we need to keep our eye right now on the things that are happening with the Abraham Peace Accords. I think that very well may be this peace agreement that's happening, and that will usher in ultimately the Antichrist. And remember, the person who's doing it will be recognized. And I think we know who this individual is. I'm personally looking at Jared Kushner. I think he fits the bill. He was recently nominated a second time for the Nobel Peace Prize for his work in the Abraham Accords. He's headed it up through the Abraham Abraham Accords Institute, I believe is what it's called. He's the one working behind the scenes and doing it. He's in a lot of ways, I think he may be the guy. We'll see, he's Jewish, and so he could certainly be the one who establishes the temple and helps to finance and facilitate the rebuilding of the temple, which is exactly what the Jews would fall victim to in the lie of the deception that we see, where it talks about him, the Messiah who's going to rebuild the temple. We know it's going to be Jesus Christ when he comes back, but the one on this side of his advent very well may be the Antichrist. And I think we may see that. And part of this peace agreement will be the rebuilding of the temple, possibly. I think so. And again, keep your eye on it. I'm not saying he is the Antichrist. I'm just saying, boy, it certainly fits the bill. So we need to keep an eye on him. And he was in the White House for a long time. He wasn't as an advisor, but he was in the halls. He walked in it. He knows the people. And certainly he's just one election away from being in the White House or being nominated to this final beast empire that may arise, will arise ultimately. Okay, with all that said, so now you know where I stand and why I believe the United States is going to be, and other Western nations are going to be part of this beast empire. I believe it'll be multiple ones. I mean, maybe you see the emergence of it right now with the UK, Australia, America, and this kind of new alliance that's forming. Other nations are going to join it. Ultimately, at the end of the day, it'll either be 7 or 10, but it'll have 10 leaders for sure, whichever. There's always an argument and debate about if it's 7 or 10 nations, depending on how you look at the heads and the horns. Don't get caught up in that too much. Just remember, at the end of the day, it's going to wind up being 10 leaders initially, and then 7 of them that will rise up. And then we'll see that really as a key when we get into Revelation 17, where it talks about these 10 and 7, and they're both synonymous in a sense, are the same. It's ultimately 10, or 7, or initially 10, and then ultimately ends up being 7 of those 10. And that will be the leaders of this final beast empire, and then they give their authority over to this Antichrist figure who rises up and becomes the in essence chosen elected leader of this final beast empire that will have global domination. And they will use economic means, it seems, from Revelation 13 to control and manipulate the world to its will. And we're seeing it happen right now with Russia and how those devastating sanctions are being applied, not just to them, but other nations. In the same way, we're going to see that happening on an individual level, where they will apply this to you using technology, and this global technology will be the other thing that we want to see, global encompassing technology that will be able to control all buying and selling all around the world, know exactly what you're doing. And if you don't play the game, if you don't accept the mark of the beast, if you don't worship the Antichrist, if you're not going to be part of the system, you'll be locked out of it. And ultimately, you'll be hated and despised as a hater, as an evil person who's standing in the way of this harmonious, new enlightenment that's happening throughout the world, that the world will want to embrace after this horrible event that's going to occur, the Gog-Magog war, and millions of people who die in it. Suddenly, the world's going to be really ready for this event to happen, with shortages and food and fuel and everything else. The world's going to want to embrace anything and anybody, and I think that's what's happening right now. I think this is some of it's orchestrated, some of it's just being manipulations by Satan himself. But at the end of the day, I think where we're headed is a movement towards this global final empire. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump into Daniel chapter 2, verse. So what am I talking about? How do I know he's going to come from the west and not from the north and so forth? Well, number one, in Ezekiel 38:39, obviously we've gone into that. You can watch those videos, but the northern king Gog, notified or labeled as Gog of Magog, is in the remotest north of Israel. So if you go north of Israel to the remotest north you can go, you're going to come to Israel, or you're going to come to Russia. I mean, you're going to identify that as modern day Russia. There's no way around it. So that is who's identified in that as that chief nation. Things that are happening right now, I think, will lead to this, and then the sanctions will push him to do something that is not in his interest to do, or against his better judgment, but he's going to do it. And I think those sanctions that we see right now is going to force him to go down, because I think he's going to stop that pipeline no matter what that goes into Europe. And Israel right now is the one who's being talked about using that pipeline through Cyprus to bring oil, natural gas into Europe. And all the nations said they're going to stop buying Russian oil and natural gas. That is a death sentence for Russia's economy, and that will easily push them into a third world status. People think that's too extreme, but it's true. If you look at their economy, it's basically 60% relying upon, depending on who you read, 60% relying upon natural gas and cells and oil too, and various products from that, to derive from that, to Europe. They cut that off, you're talking about a death sentence to the economy of Russia, and you already have a declining population, and you're now going to have this devastating economic sanctions, and then you cut off their natural gas and oil with 60% of their income, you're talking about moving them to the status of a third world country overnight, which they understand the neighborhood they live in. There's no way they're going to be able to defend their borders because they wouldn't be able to afford it. And so then you'd be susceptible to Russia, China, or you'd be susceptible to China, India, Turkey, whoever, causing mischief in your area of influence, and especially out east, in a portion of Russia. Remember, it's a massive country that you have to protect. It takes a lot of money to do that, a lot of forces. You wouldn't be able to do that. And I think he's concerned about that. And that will push him to invade Israel, as it talks about in Ezekiel 38. The stage is being set. I think it's near. Okay, so it's not Gog, it's not Magog, and we'll go into that further details in Daniel 11. But let's read Daniel chapter 2, verses 40 through 43. So Daniel is coming to explain the vision that's given to King Nebuchadnezzar, who's given this vision. It's from God to this individual king in Babylon, and he's seen this great statue, and in the statue he sees these various elements: gold, silver, bronze, and iron, at various elements of this statue. So it's legs of iron and so forth. We're going to focus on the last one. So each one of them represent a kingdom that's, in essence, have total dominion, as it were, as a predominant power. Now, that doesn't mean that there's other ones that didn't arise, but these are the key ones that God focuses on through this dream to Nebuchadnezzar. And then Daniel comes along, who was taken captive from Israel and brought to Babylon during the destruction and the captivity of the Jews when they were taken out of Israel for 70 years and dispersed because of their sin. God warned them this was going to happen. It happened. It was destroyed, and they went into captivity according to what the prophet Jeremiah had prophesied, and it came true. And Daniel was basically saying, look, I'm going to explain this vision to you because it's been given to me by God. And he starts to explain this vision to Daniel. And the king obviously said, well, I'm not going to tell you the dream, is what he was saying to his people. You tell me my dream and they give me the interpretation, because that's how, he's kind of savvy like that. These guys can tell me anything and make it sound real. Instead, he said, no, you tell me my dream and then explain it to me, and then I'll know that it's from God. And they were all like, hey, nobody can do that. Well, nobody who doesn't believe in God, but the person who believes in God, God can give you the answer to that. And Daniel did. Daniel prayed. God gave him the answer. He gave him the vision and then gave him the interpretation of that vision. So then he comes to the king and he tells him, hey, king, this is what this dream was given to you by God, and this is what happened. And he tells him the whole dream and what he saw, and then he starts to explain it, that these were all different various kingdoms, that the top of it, the head of gold, was going to be his kingdom. Then he goes into it and you get the Medo-Persian Empire. Then you have the Grecian Empire. And then you get down to the last one, which is different than all the rest. And he says, in essence, this is the Roman Empire. And he says, then in verse 40, as we get into it through 43, he says, then there will be a fourth kingdom, as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things, so that, like iron, that it breaks in pieces. It will crush and break these in pieces. In that you saw the feet and toes, partially of potter's clay and iron, and they will divide it kingdom. And part of it will be tough as iron, inasmuch as you saw iron mixed with common clay. As the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly pottery, so the kingdom will be partly brittle and partly strong. And he says, and in that you saw the iron mixed with the common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. Okay, people can take that in a lot of ways. Also, there's a spiritual element there when it talks about the seed of men. What does that mean? Does it mean that there's some kind of Nephilim type of action taking place with Satan manipulating the DNA and so forth? That could be happening. Who knows? That's a possibility, I guess, for sure. It does allude to some kind of ideal or premise to that there's going to be this kind of mingling in, as it were, of some element of fallen angel DNA, as it were. Maybe that's possible. If we go back to Genesis chapter 6, that very well could be. But what we do derive from this for sure is that there's going to be this final empire that's going to emerge. It's going to be a revived form of this one, and it talked about it as having 2 legs, and then eventually those 2 legs became 10 toes. Well, we know that the steel was 2 thighs was ultimately centered in Rome. It then became Constantinople and Rome, so expanded out, and then it became 10 toes. So we should expect another expansion, and this expansion will encompass 10. So many find it to be 10 nations and then 10 leaders, and ultimately 3 of those leaders will fall. Some people look at it as 7, depending on how you look at it as we get into the horns. But most likely, according to this, it's most likely 10 nations, 3 will eventually fall, and the Antichrist will ultimately come up to power, which we'll see that in a little bit here. So again, we see an expansion of this power of this final kingdom, and this final kingdom is going to expand out, just like it did with Rome, expand to Constantinople. We're also going to see this expansion that's going to take place with this final empire that's going to take place. Anyway, so let's go ahead and jump forward just a little bit. So we're talking about this final one who's going to come. This final leader is going to come up out of this beast empire. Who is he? Well, he's the Antichrist, obviously, and I think we're seeing possibly the emergence of that person, maybe, potentially. And again, I don't want to falsely accuse anyone, but I think that it's very potential that we are seeing someone that is filling that element of what I think is possibly, potentially, the Antichrist. So, very fascinating, extremely fascinating. I want to make sure my mic is here working here. It seemed like it was what I was doing there for a second, so I apologize. Anyway, so this who is this guy? So we know that the kingdom is probably going to come out of the west, and we'll look at that in Daniel 11 here in just a second. But I want to focus on the Antichrist just for a minute. So Daniel 8:23 through 26 is all we're going to read real quickly. It just says, in the latter period, in their rule, when the transgressions have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. His power will be mighty, but not of his own power. And he will destroy to an extraordinary degree and prosper and perform his will. And he will destroy mighty men and a holy people. And through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. And he will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the Prince of Princes, Jesus Christ, obviously, but he will be broken without human agency. Again, what we would see in Revelation 19:19, where Christ returned, they come and they take him, and then he's thrown into the lake of fire. So we see that kind of also coming along with that same element that we would expect to see in fulfillment of Revelation 19:19. So this individual is going to be different. He's going to be unlike others. He's going to come up, and it talks about this being a little horn that's going to rise up and magnify himself. He's going to be quite filled with himself, but he's also going to be quite destructive to the world in many ways. Remember, he's going to be possessed by Satan himself, is what Revelation talks about. Him actually being possessed by Satan and by this demonic being that comes up out of the abyss, called the Destroyer. He will actually be possessed by this being. So that will also be in him as well, called the Destroyer. And that's part of the ideal or premise, is that he's a possessed individual by Satan himself and by this demonic, powerful being that's, and some people attribute that same person as Satan. I don't. I think that it's giving him the name Abaddon and so forth, that he's actually some very powerful fallen angel or demonic being, whichever it is. I think demonic, and that actually possesses him. Because remember, we see demons coming out of him when it talks about in Revelation 16, where it talks about them coming out looking like frogs that come out, and they go throughout the world to deceive the men of the world, and in essence, kind of a flashback to how frogs came upon the land of Egypt. All these are imagery of judgments. Egypt, remember, is the world being judged. You have the redeemed coming out of the world in the Jewish people. All that's foreshadowing events, so what's going to happen in the end times. Well, part of that, one of the judgments was the frogs coming upon the land and going everywhere, all over the land. Well, in a sense, it talks about these demonic beings coming out of Satan, out of the false prophet, and out of the Antichrist himself, and going and deceiving the kings of the world to bring them down to the valley of judgment, to ultimately fight, not against each other per se, they think they are, but ultimately he deceives them to come there with their armies, and ultimately to fight against the coming of Jesus Christ, which he may convince them that it's a foreign entity from another dimension or another planet or whatever it is coming here, and they need to fight against him. But ultimately, you know that the end of that is that it's their end. So anyway, jump into Daniel chapter 9, verse 26. Very important verse, because what's all initiating this final tribulation period of time and the rise of this beast empire will actually be in place, I think, prior to the tribulation, at least in some kind of infant way. And the Antichrist ultimately will be in power, because he's the one that will, in essence, confirm a 7-year peace agreement. And that's what ushers in the final week of Daniel. And that's where we get the 7 weeks or the 7 years of the tribulation. It's from this prophecy of the 70 weeks that are decreed upon the nation of Israel. So God decrees this period of time, and we don't have the time to go into great detail, but basically as you read through Daniel chapter 9, basically 24 through 27, it basically goes into this 70-week period of time he's given to him, and it talks about the death of the Messiah and the destruction of the temple, which is why we know the temple had to be destroyed before the death of the Messiah had to die before the destruction of the second temple. Couldn't be somebody after that period of time. Why Jesus Christ is the only one who really fits all of those prophecies that we see. Then it goes into the fact that this one who's going to come, and that's where we're going to pick up. It says it's talking about the Antichrist of this prince who is to come is the Antichrist, is what we believe. Anyway, it says in verse 26, then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off or killed and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come, and it tells you who that prince is ultimately as we get into it. He's the one who's going to be the Antichrist. He says, will destroy the city and the sanctuary. So his people are the ones who destroy the city and sanctuary. So we know for sure that Rome and the 10th Legion under Titus, or Titus was the general at that time, went and destroyed the Vespasian was his father in essence, and he destroyed the temple and basically wound up killing well over 1 million Jews, supposedly, maybe possibly 1.5 million. Who knows? It was a lot. Destruction of the various elements of Jerusalem, and for the revolt, as it were, and then rebellion towards Rome, and then ultimately that led to later we have the Maccabean revolt, but that's a little bit later. So anyway, they want to destroy. So we know for sure that it's Rome. So that tells you right then and there that the people of the prince who is to come, the Antichrist of the people who is to come, will come from this revived form of this Roman Empire. That's how we know for sure this final beast empire is Rome. So people will say from Daniel 2, how do you know it's Rome and not some other power? Well, this is why we know it's Rome, because it's the people of those who destroyed the temple. And we know that Rome was the one who destroyed it, and under the emperor's orders, ultimately. And anyway, it wound up being destroyed. Thus, you have identification of Rome. And so the revived Roman Empire will be the one who will come out of this, and it will be much broader, much wider than just ultimately Rome, which was initially done. And then we know Constantinople came later, and Constantine, that was 300 years later. And then we know that it will expand again into 10 from the various verses that we just read previously. So anyway, so it goes on to say, it says, and he, verse 27, and he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, or 7 years. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain, which means there, again, has to be a temple, because he's going to put a stop to these things, which means part of this peace agreement most likely will encompass or include the rebuilding of the temple and sacrificial system that we see. So that's going to be part of it. We see them already practicing, having a priesthood, having the elements all reestablished and so forth. We see that with the Temple Mount Institute. Everything's in place for raising up red heifers and all this stuff already happening in Israel right now. Reconstituting of their vestments and garb and training a priesthood that are Kohanim and so forth. All that's already happening in Israel right now. None of that has to be created from scratch. It's there. Even the anointing of the altar they've done. So they have an altar that they've already done. They've anointed it. They've sacrificed animals and so forth. And they take this and they're going to put that in the bigger altar when they do it. So it's going to be rebuilt. It's coming very soon. And the Antichrist ultimately is going to be part of that establishment of this covenant, is what it's saying. And he's going to make a firm covenant. He's going to make the agreement based upon his strength and power and position, saying, I'm going to guarantee, he's going to be the guarantor of this covenant. But in the middle of it, it's 3.5 years, he's going to go in, declare himself to be God, as we know, from 2 Thessalonians 2, where he goes in there and he basically declares himself to be God and puts an end to it and sets up this kind of idol in the temple, or on the wing of the temple, which we see in Revelation 13, verses 14 and 15. But in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, basically verses 3, 4, and 5, it talks about him going to the temple, declaring himself to be God, and so forth. And everybody needs to worship him. And then we know that's part of Revelation 13, where he is, in essence, possessed by Satan, fully in control of the world's planet for 3.5 years, the final 3.5 years. He's in control, or to a degree, for 7 years, but in total control of the world for 3.5 years, where he, in essence, really creates hell on earth, and the destruction of so many people and lives will end because of that. But this is how we get this, and so how we know that he's from the west, not from the north, not from the south, not from the east, and why that is going to be. So we should expect to see a Western alliance of powers that will rise up after this northern horde comes down and is destroyed, which we know as the Gog-Magog alliance, and that will be destroyed. And then I believe we're going to see this final vacuum filled by this beast empire. So anyway, we're going to pick up in chapter 2, or part 2. I hope this is a blessing to you as we study through this. Just keep studying, keep looking up. I think the time's very near, and we need to be alert, ready, looking, praying, and sharing. God bless. We'll see you.